Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. This week I want to talk about adding options for player characters in your game. So if you're like me and you've been on a lot of Discords and before that Facebook forums and watched videos and read blog posts, you'll see that in old school games, things like BX, which I talk about a lot here, OSE, Swords and Wizardry, original Dungeons and Dragons, people are often wanting to add something to the game because often the thing I hear is this X character class is useless after or is useless if, so they want to add something to kind of, for lack of a better word, add some balance so that the player playing those classes will always kind of have something to do. Now, generally speaking, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that the player character having something to do has a lot more to do with the player being, on the ball and trying stuff. But I too have dipped into that, and I have a video where I add some extra options for, let's say, magic users. Because that's where we see it a lot, right? You've got this first level magic user, they only have one spell, and they only have a dagger, so they got nothing else to do. Watch that video, but basically in this video, I want to talk about the other end of it, the martial classes, as they say, fighters. Because recently, I've just been seeing a lot of things where people, and this is not new, but just recently I've seen a few, where people are talking about adding special moves or extra abilities or proficiencies or however you want to do it to fighters, because fighters can become, they'll say, you just roll your die and hit and move on because there's not special moves, right? In like an OSR game, a fighter rolls the same D20 everybody else rolls. They just maybe have a better chance of hitting. So while I think that adding lots of cool maneuvers and stuff can be fun, and I've delved a little bit into like making weapons matter more in that sense, which would really lean into the fighter's ability to use every weapon, I do think that there are two things. One kind of built into the system and one that's kind of in the zeitgeist, if you will, that are there that already do this for fighters. And perhaps we don't really see them if we're stepping too far back or we're too close. I don't know, wherever you're standing. Or maybe if you're new to this style of player, if you've come from other games that have things and you're like, oh, that's neat. So again, I'm not saying you shouldn't add these things, but let's just discuss a couple of things that make fighters good already. One of the key abilities of the fighter, the straight up fighter, in pretty much any D&D-like RPG, is that they can use any weapon and they can use any armor. And if you go to really more simple games like BX, and I also believe Swords of Wizardry, and even Hyperborea and some of the games like that, and I think also DCC, you'll find that that's pretty much true. When you go to something like AD&D First Edition, you do have weapon proficiencies, so while they could use everything, they can't just use them without proficiency. But I'm not going to delve deep into AD&D, but, they still have more than anybody else. So inherently, the fighter's ability to use various weapons is one of their strengths. And I think that as a fighter player, and as a DM to fighter players, we have to recognize and allow the fighters to use these weapons, even if there's not something specially mechanically built into it, in ways that make sense. So, for instance, and this is interesting because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't looked at it in a while, but in the example of play in Holmes Basics, not really example of play, there's like an example of combat that's kind of mixed into the combat section, and straight up in the rules of Chainmail, which of course was supposed to be used with OD&D, so we're talking about that same time period, we get stuff like pass through fire, and even multiple shots with bows. And you might say, well, okay, whatever, but when we think about it, there's a lot of classes that can't use a bow, right? Because when I say fighter, like if you're playing something like OSE, where you'll be like, well, the dwarf and halfling can use bows. Well, they're fighters, right? Straight up dwarf class, straight up halfling class, human fighter, they're all fighters, right? The thief can also use a bow, so maybe that's a factor there, but that's something that a fighter can do. Pass through fire is simply that if an enemy has to move more than half their movement, you can, no matter who won initiative, you can shoot at them as they approach. This is incredibly powerful. And again, if we go all those back to OD&D, magic users don't really have a weapon. I mean, I guess you could throw a dagger, but they don't have any missile weapons they can use, and clerics also have no missile weapons they can use. This is an incredible strength of the fighter. The idea that the fighter would be ready with their bow to shoot any enemies approaching, then quickly switch to their melee weapon when, melee was hit. I think this is something that's overlooked and something we want to keep in mind, right? So if you're a DM or if you're a player and you want to suggest it to your DM, and you have enemies that are a decent distance away and they start moving towards the player characters, You might just simply allow the fighter to get a free shot, if you will. And I say fighter because, again, if you have thieves in your game, you're playing like BX, maybe you only make it a fighter thing if you want to. Again, now I'm changing the rules. But basically, if you look at some of those games, they have this ability, pass through fire. So now, forgetting about that, though, just having missile weapons in general is a great idea. If you're far enough away that you can retreat, then you can retreat back and stay out of missile range. So the ability of a fighter to use any kind of missile weapon is super good. Also, any kind of other weapon, right? They can have pole weapons and keep enemies back. Right. Again, not every system has rules for that, but if I've got a, 10-foot long spear or a pikes are really long, and I'm using that, right, just sticking it out in front of me in a dungeon, there should be a good chance that I can get a first attack. Again, even if the enemy won initiative. When they're closing in on me, again, this is that kind of like braced for impact thing. Instead of just letting it be for anything, I mean, you could use this. Now, because this is bleeding over into what I was going to talk about second, but the idea of allowing the fighter to use all the weapons they can use in really crafty ways is key. Really using any player character. But this is what we want to think of. And we want to help our players understand that this can be the case through having enemies do it so they can learn, through conversations, through allowing them to do weird things like shooting a chandelier down with an arrow to knock out the ogre in the other room, right? Through making a trap on the ground with a lasso and pulling it back with their great strength. Where planting extra arrows in the ground to shoot faster. They're knocking a boulder on somebody. Let people do things that aren't in the rules, because I think that is the part I was going to say that was kind of in the zeitgeist. That's the part that I think exists in the game that people were doing and people do, myself included, that isn't necessarily in the rules. You get a game like DCC that starts to mechanize this, right? To teach us, in a sense, that, hey, fighters are cool. They should be able to do something cool every round. So here's an ability that we're going to add to the fighters, the Mighty Deed. And we'll see, type in DCC Mighty Deed, you'll see you'll see a lot of D&D YouTubers talk about adding it to their game because it's a cool mechanic. Basically, it just means that the fighter can always do something extra and they simply roll a die. And if they succeed, then they get to do it, right? I would say, forget about a die. Use your best judgment or create some kind of a roll on the thing. You don't need a rule for that. You can just say, listen, you're a fighter. You want to do cool fightery things? Do them, right? You're a thief. You want to do cool thief things? Do them. We will adjudicate based on the situation, right? You might know how to quickly organize troops or find the best place for cover when the enemy is throwing Molotov cocktails at you, right? You're a fighter. You should know that stuff, which means that even if you, and this is especially true when you're playing Theater of the Mind, even if you as a player don't necessarily have that straight up, the technique down, you could say to the GM, hey, I want to find cover and I'm a fighter. Where's the best place for me to hide? I would know that, right? And, the GM should be okay with that. So I guess what I'm saying is you don't necessarily have to add a bunch of mighty deeds or special moves to the game if everybody at the table understands or is on the same page as to what a truly proficient expert fighter would be able to do. And if you just allow that stuff to work, or at least them to try it, again, it doesn't always have to work. Pretty funny example. When I was playing, I said, to the GM, there was a bunch of enemies, and I was like, what I want to do is, one of them had oil flasks, and I'm like, I want to shoot the oil flask off his belt to have it like smash on the ground and shatter at their feet. So he's like, okay, you could try that. So I rolled really well. I got it, and it splashed at their feet, and they're standing there because we're having a volley back and forth with arrows. So then I'm like, I wonder if I shot my arrow off and I try to nick it off their armor and create a spark to light it on fire. And they're like, you could try to just kind of nick him with the arrow. And I did it. And he's like, yeah, there's a little tiny spark, nothing happened. Because it wouldn't work, right? Or maybe you'd allow a roll for it. But the funny thing is, they let me try it. They weren't just like, no, I can't do that. You roll to hit. If you hit, then that means you stick an arrow in and they do damage. None of this lighting a fire, none of this cutting things off their belt. But if you do that, if you keep saying you don't allow it for that kind of stuff, then you have to add these extra rules. And in my mind, I would just rather not do that. I'd rather not have the extra rules. I'd rather just allow the players to do things when it makes sense, right? So going back to something that really is in the rules, which I was supposed to talk about first, the way that I framed this, but hey, you know what? It's wild out here. I can do what I want. Okay. Number 2, which was the first thing I was going to talk about, which is somewhat tied into this. Because a fighter can use every weapon, they can use every magic weapon. And one of the things that I see in a lot of OSR games, like more modern games or NSR, or I don't know what OSRs people are doing, but they seem to be stingy. And you have to remember that the game, and I've talked about this a lot with Treasure, you have to remember the game wants the fighters to have stuff, right? Something like 20%, I'm not looking it up, but somewhere around 20% of magic items are magical weapons. And fighters can use all of them. Some of the magical weapons, like a magic dagger, I think that might be one magic mace. A cleric could use that, right? But everything else is basically something fighters can use. And the most powerful of those things is magical swords. Now, I'm pretty sure I did a whole video on magic swords, the special swords, and using them in your game. And if you think about these special swords, they are more powerful than a regular sword, obviously, because they have special abilities. But also, they'll do things like, allow you to fly, or do extra damage, or turn invisible, or detect magic, or some of the things other classes can do with spells, right? So as the fighter progresses, and more, the magic user starts getting fireballs and invisibility spells and this and that, the fighter can have magical weapons that will help them kind of balance with them. And that's built into the game. You don't have to do anything special there. Just give out the treasure the way it's kind of listed in the book. And I know that some people say, well, that's too much treasure or whatever. But again, it's a game, and you can do it a lot of different ways. We've talked about this before. If you want to say the first time they get find a magic sword, it's a magic sword. The second time they find a magic sword, maybe their sword just levels up in power because of the deed that they did, and you can just kind of give it extra abilities. There's lots of ways to do this if you don't want to feel like there's a ton of magic swords out there in the world. But giving fighters, or having available in your world for fighters to find, is probably a better way to say it, magical swords is a real balance point here. A magical sword that allows a fighter to do all kinds of special magical abilities, beyond just +1 to hit or whatever, is key to making the fighters really stand out and have that extra ability. Giving them that magical armor, making it available so that the fighter can then take their magic armor, they're in their magic chain or plate, they've got their magic sword, they can face enemies others couldn't. In fact, there's enemies that can only be hit by magic, right? So let's say, I don't know, a ghoul, right? Is a ghoul? Maybe a white. A white can only be hit by magic, right? So you might say, well, okay, a magic spell too, but like sleep's not going to work on a white, right? Charm's not going to work. So what? Magic missile? So really the fighter, besides the cleric, is going to be the most powerful warrior in that case, right? If there's a bunch of whites that you're fighting, they might, if the cleric can't turn them all, the fighter is going to be possibly the only one that can actually even fight them. They're the fighter, right? So think about this before you start adding a bunch of stuff to your games, mechanically. And I know it's super fun. Think about how can you do it just in the world? How can we rule the game or run the game, so the rule as opposed to rulings, differently so that we don't feel like we're lacking, right? If you have a fighter in your group and they say, oh, I can't do anything because X, maybe try to make it clear they can. I can't do anything against this creature because it's flying. The magic user can fly up there. Well, you have a bow, right? The magic user doesn't have a bow. Okay? I can't withstand, whatever. They're shooting arrows and the magic user has protection from normal missiles. Well, right, but you're also in plate mail +2. The chance of them hitting you is low. Also, they're super low level. You're going to cleave right through them. So, we're talking about, you don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe goblins shooting arrows, something, right? These are things that you sometimes just have to remind the fighter players about so that they understand that all the options in the world are there in front of you. Not like in the world, but in the world. That's the point of playing a role-playing game versus playing something else that's very like a miniature skirmish game or something else. You can use the narrative to make your character valuable all the time. And this doesn't just mean fighters. Again, it means magic users, it means thieves, it means clerics. How can I use my various abilities outside of just what's written exactly in the book? If we start thinking like this, then we can slim down our rule books and let tables flow naturally based on what makes sense in that world that you're running. So I would love to know what you think about this. This is almost like a little bit of a rant. Sorry if it came off as a rant, but I'm just thinking about it. I just feel like I'm always tempted to add lots of stuff to the game, but generally what I found is adding a bunch of extra rules that I don't use that much isn't that beneficial. Rather, encouraging the players to play the way that I'm describing has made my game way more fluid and way more fun for me as a GM So I don't have to worry about all the rules. We can just deal with it in person. And I want to say, for those who might say, oh, this is just Mother May I, which I hear a bunch. Maybe I need to make a video about that. No, it's not. It's a conversation. You're not asking the DM if you can do something. You're saying, you said there was boulders on top of this cliff. I'm going to run up and wedge my spear in it and tip it over, right? And the GM is not, can I do it? It's like, this is what I want to do. And I think a good GM is going to say, let's give it a shot.